Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me come. It's really exciting to give this talk. Really hard acts to follow, though. One of the nice things, though, is that I think there's some themes that I've tried to build in to this that connect with earlier speakers. First one is I'm actually from St. Paul, just a little east of Minneapolis, a little southeast of Fargo, if you know where Fargo is. Today I'm going to talk about some trends in other industries that I think were touched on last night in the talk about how those influence medical devices and what we're doing today. Talk a little bit in specifics about preclinical trends and then focus on some clinical trends, including some things and experiences in things like the FDA's early feasibility study program, potential concerns about the ever-increasing data needs and rigor needs that regulatory authorities are seeking, and even reimbursement is seeking now, and then finally touched on one example of a blend of technology and trends in risk-based monitoring. A big theme here, work harder, work smarter, not harder, right? I think we can use all these tools to be more efficient, try to bring things to market faster, bring it to a wider audience across the globe to really benefit public health. So, in general, we are seeing ubiquitous, cheaper, faster technology. We see that with mobile health, we see that with Apple. We touched on big data last night, cloud computing, things like that. There are some caveats, I think, with big data that I think we need to be a little bit cognizant of. And this is from a New York Times article last week. Some quotes here said, if you're trying to make important decisions about your health, wellness, or happiness, big data alone isn't enough. You need to be smart about how you're using the data, how you're trying to make those decisions. And some of that goes back to simple things like randomized comparisons. When you're doing a Google search, I've heard an anecdote last week, when you're clicking a button, you're taking actually part in about 7 randomized comparisons, 7 experiments when you do that click. And they're using that, along with all the big data, to make decisions on how to better design their products. So that type of aspect, taking the big data with some classic elements of clinical research, preclinical research, combining those together, I think are going to help us move things forward faster. Internet of Things, connectivity, that's another big thing we've touched on a couple times. The Apple Watch, your refrigerator connected to the internet, your thermostat connected to the internet. We're seeing these things, and the device industry is really leading and executing on these trends, not just talking about it. So I'll skip through some of these. Electronic informed consent, I think, is one interesting example that we're starting to see. FDA has issued a guidance document on this, and you can imagine the other day when you signed your consent form to be photographed or videotaped, right? You could do that electronically on your app or your phone. We could sit here and we could do a randomized experiment to determine perhaps the ideal temperature in the room, right? We could do that all mobily, and that's not very far away at all. Finally, we're using these tools in the context of clinical studies for things like remote or risk-based monitoring to reduce some of those costs of the clinical studies, because monitoring, we'll talk about, is really one of the most significant cost drivers. And a lot of these are reflected really in documents and guidances that are coming from FDA and other European regulatory bodies. We've also talked about some examples of strategic partnerships that are taking place, this idea of collaboration. I think that's a really key thing to think about in the whole process of preclinical and clinical research. We see strategic partnerships between hospitals and manufacturers. Some of this is driven by the Affordable Care Act. We're seeing joint ventures, right? A lot of this isn't a zero-sum game where it's winner or loser. It's these groups can compete against each other. Somebody else mentioned an example with their phone, right? I'm using OneNote, a Microsoft product, on my Apple phone, and I use the Chrome browser. It plays together really nicely. It's a great, great world to live in. So there are some broader economic trends that I think are challenging the FDA and regulators that are influencing what we're seeing in the clinical space. One of those is the high turnover that the Centers for Devices is experiencing. That really creates some challenges as we go through the review process, because we have new reviewers that are maybe inexperienced. They're very interested in science and public health, but that doesn't always make our lives easier in terms of trying to get devices through that process. On the other hand, some of the new creative ideas that they're bringing to the table are maybe going to give us a little more flexibility and some interesting ideas on solving problems. Cost pressures are existing for everyone. The FDA is looking to do more with less. Congress is pushing them on that. Payers are pushing them, and the public is also pushing as well. So let's step a little bit into preclinical trends. One of the broad things we're seeing is an integration of the preclinical and clinical process, and this is something that we're trying to do at NAMSA. NAMSA, we call ourselves an MRO, a medical research organization. This is a little different than a CRO. An MRO is a CRO on steroids. So what we try to do is try to take the processes of a CRO, the good things, build in some of the skill sets of an academic research center, some of the cutting edge technologies, and then really span the process with the array of services. So we move from testing to preclinical to clinical and beyond more smoothly and in a more integrated fashion. One general clinical trend that I've talked to colleagues about is the need to keep sample sizes small in certain cases. Other times there is a need for more data, so there is a little bit of a balance, and I think being careful on how we set that up is important. There's definitely more emphasis on veterinary care and oversight, wellness, health, and comfort of the animals. I think it's good ethical practice to improve upon all times. Looking for potentially the role of biological risk assessments to take the place of studies from time to time. There are cases where that can make a lot of sense, other cases where we still really need preclinical work. And then eventually we're going to see more harmonization of standards. That's just coming. It's part of the world we live in as a global economy. So I talked again about that MRO, and one of the things that we really do at NAMSA is try to do collaboration and provide additional value in the preclinical steps. So, for example, we'll try to leverage regulatory consultants and bring them into the FDA discussions during the pre-submission and get them involved early on so they can understand and they can predict the challenges that they're going to see down the road, maybe refining the indications for use, the labeling, trying to plan ahead for the clinical studies based on early experiences with preclinical work. We try to pilot when it makes sense, tools that you'll eventually use later in the clinical program. So for example, we might pilot a database in the preclinical study, then we can copy that database essentially over in the clinical with some modifications based on things that we've learned that can help save some substantial time and also lead to higher quality data. We can pilot test endpoints, whether those be surrogate endpoints or what have you. The data collection process, that it can all, again, speed and accelerate the time to market. So we're trying to bring in data management staff earlier in the process. We're also trying to bring in more sophisticated study designs and statistical analyses. So we'll bring a biostatistician to the lab, have them watch the device. That, again, can help them understand really how the device is working or is supposed to work, how it might work better, how you might define endpoints for your clinical study later on to enhance that process. And then finally, we can try to tie all of this together. We take the preclinical models and results and tie it through simulation into predictions of how clinical trials are actually going to run. That can, again, save substantial time in terms of the sample size or the duration of the study that's needed if we can do a good job, build a good predictive model. And then we can, of course, loop back when we get a new generation device with some refinements and further that prediction model. The goal really when you get to your clinical study with all of this is to have a really boring clinical study that's very predictable, because if you have to redo it, if there are surprises that's going to delay the release to market, that's going to be extremely costly. So all of this is really intended to try to, by the time you get to the clinical study, make sure you know almost everything that's going to happen. I think one group that we've been involved with that is really doing some great things is the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. One of the initiatives they have is on computational modeling and simulation. And they're doing this to really validate models and try to accelerate and streamline the regulatory process. The whole goal is to reduce the time and cost to market while improving patient safety. And there's actually examples out there of this sort of integrated modeling approach of taking the preclinical data and trying to tie it into predicting and modeling eventual clinical data. So it's not just doing the models to check the box to satisfy the requirement of the preclinical study, of the biocompatibility test, of the clinical study. It's tying the whole process together to try to learn continually and predict those next steps in the process. So I do want to offer a word of caution though, right? There are a lot of sophisticated methods that we've talked about a lot that I've worked on over the years. Sometimes I think those can be shiny objects, like, ooh, what's that shiny object? Ooh, there's a squirrel, right? You got to be careful that they're not a distraction just because they're exciting. And there's been some examples of these. This was from a transcript of an advisory panel meeting last fall, where the statistician on the panel noted that we're stuck in this incredible position where once you do the Bayesian analysis, you're still nervous. The Bayesian analysis he was referring to was based on the FDA's guidance document for Bayesian studies of medical devices. It used a piecewise exponential model with historical prior information and adaptive study design, adaptive sample size, but it really confused the docs in the end because the data had some difficulties. And so this sophisticated analysis and design was not enough to sort of protect the product from those concerns. And so everyone, wanted to reduce things to simpler terms, and we had to really approach the audience with a more lower common denominator analysis that people could understand and feel comfortable with. And so I think when you're exploring things like modeling or some new adaptive study design, things like that, you need to really consider who the audience is, right? The regulators are one, and they may actually encourage some of these things, but you need to think further down the road about the payers, about the actual physician community that's going to be using things and listening to these presentations at conferences, because they're going to be skeptical as well as things that are maybe cutting edge, so cutting edge that sometimes you bleed. There is a forthcoming CDRH guidance document coming on adaptive study design. This is different than the one that's out there for biologics and drugs. We're expecting that pretty soon. Next, I want to talk about clinicals trends. And one in particular I think that's interesting is the FDA's early feasibility study. And I'm going to move fast here. So historically, first-in-human studies have been outside the US. And that's really led to a delay in technologies getting to the US population. So the FDA has this new program called the Early Feasibility Study, which is the stated goal to speed novel devices to market. It's really a growing program. There have been 10 approvals in 2014, 2017 already this year. And they have guidance documents out on this. It's very nice because they acknowledge in the guidance some of the value of things like computational modeling to help understand durability, and then iterate the design of the device through the feasibility study, which I think is a very interesting idea, one that I don't know that they've really executed on, or at least that there's much out there public with it yet. We do have some experiences with this that we've talked with some clients about. Overall, they found it to be very interactive, but not necessarily leading to faster IDE approvals. Although overall, the trend is encouraging. It went from 226 days for median time to approval in 2013 to 66 days so far in 2015, but it's still a relatively new and small program, so very often you'll get questions from reviewers that you'll have to remind them, this is early feasibility, this is a little bit different, we don't have to have the full rigor and burden of a traditional IDE. There's other programs FDA is using to try to accelerate the process, Expedited Access Program for speeding time to market for life-threatening diseases, trying to relax maybe the pre-approval requirements and put some of the burden on the post-approval world, maybe considering surrogate endpoints and trying to overall be more interactive in their review. There are a couple guidance documents that I think speak to some of the roles of this program. That includes the benefit risk determination guidance and balancing pre and post-market data needs. So there is a general thought that over time, regulators are wanting more data, more rigor in their studies, and with a new deputy commissioner who has a very strong clinical trials background, translational research background, I think there's certainly maybe some belief that that's going to continue. But actually, he was at a conference with the MDIC last week where he spoke really to the need for simpler or more efficient data collection. And it wasn't that we needed more data or less data, we really need the right data. So it was being very careful, working smarter, not harder. And finally, a role of patient preference in all of this has a big role. And Teramatics had the Maestro device, which was approved recently, which really, patient preference played a big role in that because the efficacy was maybe not as strong as many had hoped, but FDA had demonstrated that patients were willing to accept a smaller efficacy benefit with some safety concerns. Generally, there's been increasing panel reviews, more IVDs. I've taken one device to the circulatory panel 3 times for the same device for the same indication. FDA has a new guidance on this that helps try to outline some of the procedures and how it should work better. The role of public session, I think open public session, I think is becoming more important. And that's really been clear. People have been tweeting that the public presentations where the patients stand up and talk about their need for the device, the clinician society stand up and talk about the need for the device, can really help push the panel towards a positive vote. There's always some unpredictability, though. We had Wilford Brimley come to one recently. He stayed on task. He didn't talk about oatmeal. He didn't talk about diabetes. He talked about what he was supposed to that day. So. Finally, we're going to touch on risk-based monitoring just really quickly. Historically, this has been the largest really contributor to the cost of clinical studies. But there's been move by both FDA and other regulatory bodies to try to move away from 100% monitoring approach to a risk-based approach that was really focused to help still ensure patient safety and data accuracy. And there have been studies that have shown that 90% of identifiable issues can be really identified via centralized remote monitoring rather than the need to go have all those site visits, spend all that time and travel money. So overall, I think this fits with the idea of using that team collaboration, data management, quality, biostatistics, and the corporate management to try to tie it all together, save resources, work smarter, not harder. So again, these are just sort of some of the themes that I've seen in the area, some of the themes that others have touched on in the talks today, and I really want to thank you guys for your time and attention.